I am obsessed with Fire Force. I just finished the entire manga and I can't stop talking about how much I love this manga. It's actually insane how fast it became one of my all-time favorites. But I'm not a complete meathead. The series does have its issues, and it's those issues that killed a lot of the series hype when the anime first came out, and why people still have a hard time getting into the series, even if they're big fans of Soul Eater. So in this video, I'd like to share my thoughts on Fire Force, address some of the popular criticisms, and explain why Fire Force is one of the best manga I've ever read. Now, obviously, when we're talking about Fire Force, the majority of people are going to experience it through the anime. I mean, that's where I started out at least. I was never really a Soul Eater fan. I wasn't a fan of the Fire Force manga. I just saw a cool series about superpowered firefighters and thought, okay, this looks pretty cool. And of course, a lot of people felt the same way the first time they saw that first opening. And the hype continued for the first few episodes until we saw more and more of Tamaki. It's no secret that her whole identity is fan service. I mean, that's just what she's there for. And, you know, the first time you're like, whatever. But when it happens again and again and again, you're like, okay, this is getting old now. And it didn't take that long for most people. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure it was right around the Rekka fight that I saw people hopping on the internet saying, yeah, I'm done with this series. Which, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and say is a very reasonable issue to have. Because with some series, if you don't like fan service, it only happens so often and you can just ignore it. But in Fire Force, it happens so often that you cannot possibly follow this story and ignore it. Again, with Tamaki, it's basically her entire character. But it's not just her. You also have the scene with Maki and a comment from Obi that's in episode like 1 or 2. You have 1 or 2 scenes with Lisa. There's a bunch of fan service littered throughout the story, and for a lot of people, it's just not worth the awkwardness of constantly being reminded of it to invest in the story. And again, I can't really say anything because I'm not that crazy about it myself. But that isn't to say it's the only issue people have with Fire Force. Actually, before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So you'll have someone drop Fire Force and be like, oh, I hate the characters in Fire Force, I just couldn't get through that series. And in response, you might be like, oh yeah, I get it, Tamaki can be kind of annoying with the fan service. Now, in most cases, that person will correct you and say, no, I just don't like any of the characters. Because more often than not, if someone drops Fire Force, they don't just dislike Tamaki, they really don't like any of the characters. And I can kinda see why. For example, I never used to like Arthur. In fact, I even used to say that I didn't like Arthur because I thought he had zero chemistry with Shinra, and I thought their dynamic was kinda forced. But when I reread the manga, for whatever reason, it just sorta clicked. Instead of trying to be some intellectual elitist, I just sorta went with the flow, and eventually, like Ohkubo, I leaned into the gimmick and was like, oh, that's just Arthur.
Wait a sec. I'm definitely right-handed. Why is Excalibur in my left hand?
So by the end, I kinda liked the bit. That isn't to say you should just shut your brain off when you read Fire Force. But clearly, if you only focus on the negatives, you'll put yourself in a place where it's easy to ignore the many overwhelming positives. Now again, despite those positives, a lot of people end up dropping the anime. On the one hand, you have the amazing openings. You have the gorgeous animation and sound design that you can only get from Dave Pro. And you also have amazing fights. But while I love the characters, a lot of people either hate them or just think they're kinda boring. To that, I can kinda see where people are coming from. I mean, now that I've read Soul Eater and Fire Force, I still think Soul Eater low-key has the better characters. So I'm not too mad about that. Couple that with the overwhelming level of fan service, and a lot of people decide to drop the anime. But even ignoring the issues with the characters and the fan service, a lot of people drop Fire Force simply because they don't like the early story. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not that mad at that either. Again, I fell in love with Fire Force right away, but I also couldn't help but notice how the story is kind of a slow burn. And if you don't believe me, then just hear me out. As an example, let's look at Season 1. So Season 1 adapts everything up through the Netherworld arc, which is a good arc to end on, but that means for 24 episodes, all you have is the introduction arc, the fights against Company 1 and Company 5, the Asakusa arc, Vulcan's Workshop, and then the Netherworld arc. Not to say that any of these are bad arcs, but nothing crazy happens until later. So first they fight off against other companies, and in this time they fight a bunch of Infernals. Then they go to Asakusa and fight a bunch of Infernals and Whiteclads. Then they go to Vulcan's workshop where they fight a bunch of Whiteclads and lose. Then they finally get to the Netherworld at the very end of the season. I liked the first season, but when I started back from chapter 1, I couldn't help but feel that this story takes its time getting to the good stuff. Which is fine because obviously the payoff is astronomical. But if you already hate the series because of the characters and the fan service, and then you're like, dude, when is something gonna happen? Then it's not hard to imagine why you would drop this series. Now, I've spent more than enough time addressing the haters, but only because I think it's important to be honest about the series' shortcomings and be real when we talk about why more than a few people end up dropping the story. But now that I'm done playing devil's advocate, I can finally go full meathead and give you my completely unhinged case for why this is one of my all-time favorite manga. First of all, I cannot understate just how much I love the plot of this story. I don't want to say too much on this only because I'm going to do another video dedicated to the topic, but one of my biggest problems with Soul Eater is how messy the plot in that story gets. But when you read Fire Force, it becomes clear just how much Ohkubo learned from that experience and grew as a writer. While I can see where there's things in the story that were probably thrown in or put together at the last second, it is clear to anyone who reads this story that everything from Volume 1 all the way to Volume 34 was carefully crafted and deliberately organized. As a matter of fact, I would even argue Ohkubo is one of the best writers in terms of planning and foreshadowing. Now, whether he's the all-time best is hard to say when you have someone like Oda, but there are so many payoffs and twists and just genuinely satisfying moments in this story that it's hard to not love Ohkubo's writing. All the stuff with the Evangelist and the Whiteclads and where the Infernals come from and the mystery behind Shinra's family and his powers and the world building. That's another thing I almost forgot. The world building is so good in this story. You have the Empire, you have Hajime, you have the Church. Oh, the Church! Oh my god, the Church is so good in this story. Because in any other story, the characters would be like, ew, gross, Church. Which, there's definitely a lot of that in this story, but you also have tons of scenes where the characters have honest conversations. Where they're like, okay, so the church is probably a total lie, but there's also a lot of good people who use it to make their and everyone else's lives even better. And you're just like, oh, that's such good writing. Because it's a real problem presented in a real way with no real answer. It just goes to show how good the world building is and how much time and thought went into the themes of this story. And speaking of time and thought, obviously another thing everyone loves about Fire Force is the art. Now obviously we already talked about Dave Bro and the anime, but the real credit goes to Ohkubo. I mean, coming from someone who loves the art in Soul Eater, I opened that first chapter and I was like, holy crap. The detail in the backgrounds is so intricate, it makes everything look so real. And not real in like a boring sort of way, I mean real in like it looks and feels real. For example, there's a lot of cars and bikes in Fire Force, and you see all the individual parts and engines, and anyone who loves cars or machines will be like, oh my god, I love it. Sure, Fire Force may not be as stylized as Soul Eater, but the art is just as good. Arguably better in some ways. Another part of the art is the paneling. The paneling in Fire Force is awesome. One thing that still sticks out is the paneling where we get introduced to Sho's Adela Burst and the panels are all separated. I still remember reading that like, oh, that's so good. And obviously, since this is Ohkubo we're talking about, all the character designs are on point too. I mean, I don't think there's a single bad character design in Fire Force. And on a similar note, I also love the fights in Fire Force. The fights in Fire Force are amazing, and there's so many good ones too. Shinra versus Sho, Benimaru and Joker versus the Assassins, Arthur versus Dragon. Oh my god. I'm not gonna really say anything for spoiler reasons, but oh my god, that fight is so good. When these chapters were still coming out weekly, people were hyping the shit out of this fight, and I can finally see why. If you want to read one of the best fights in manga, then you have to read Fire Force and see this fight. There's a bunch of reasons why I love the fights. Obviously, there's cool characters that are cool looking, the paneling and choreography are great, there's always a ton of build-up and great character dynamics. If you're a meathead, it's also just fun to watch cool characters fight each other with cool abilities, oh, and also they're on fire. So there's meathead appeal to the fights, but there's also layers to these fights that make them worth revisiting. But more than anything, more than the characters, more than the art, more than the fights, I love the ending of Fire Force. I already touched on this when I talked about the plot, and this is kind of part of that discussion too, but I cannot stop thinking about how this is one of the best endings in manga, and for so many goddamn reasons. First of all, it answers every question. Oh, and before I say anything, you might want to skip this part if you want to avoid spoilers. Anyway, it answers every question with satisfying answers, and not just like, oh yeah, I guess I forgot about that. It ties everything together in an elegant way. Everyone gets a good moment or fight in the end. We see everyone work together. There's twists and surprises. And then, of course, the thing everyone has heard about by now. There's the fact that Ohkubo connects the Fire Force world to the Soul Eater world. But oh my god, it was so much better than I could have imagined. Because it's so easy for a writer to be like, oh yeah, here's this thing that was in my other story, so they're connected, I guess. But Ohkubo goes above and beyond. He completely recontextualizes Soul Eater and Fire Force. First of all, I was always reading Fire Force and would always be bothered by like how in Soul Eater the backgrounds would be twisted and warped, but in Fire Force you never get that and the perspectives are always nice and organized. But then you learn about the timeline of the like old world and the current world, and then the Soul Eater world, and you're like, oh my god, it makes perfect sense. Of course Fire Force backgrounds have a ton of detail and they're all straight because they come from the last world. And of course the Soul Eater world is all trippy and goofy because it came from Shinra, who would only know like half of everything, and has a meathead teenage brain. Oh my god, it makes perfect sense. And then you get the connection between Despair, which in Fire Force is already brilliantly done, but then you find out that it's basically the source of the madness in Soul Eater. And madness is easily one of the best aspects of Soul Eater. So you get that connection and you're like, that's it, the man's a genius, this is a freaking genius. There's a bunch of other examples, but I just love the way Ohkubo handled things. Because of that, it's been the most excited I've ever been for any manga ending in a while. So, you have great characters, insane fights, gorgeous art, and brilliant writing. You take all that and it's easy to understand why so many people are obsessed with Fire Force. Granted, it does have its issues. The series isn't perfect and it's not hard to understand why people drop it or don't like it that much. But no story is perfect. And despite its flaws, I have no problems saying that Fire Force is easily one of my all-time favorite series. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate Fire Force? How does it compare to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Soul Eater. In that video, I share my thoughts on the entire Soul Eater series. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.